Tonight, the war in Gaza. A blistering report by the UN accuses both sides of war crimes. What's next?
Christian Amanpour, crack reporter, interviews His Honor Richard Goldstone of Gaza fact-finding mission fame about his controversial report. It's her job to keep him honest. To do so, she needs to have done her homework. You be the judge. Is Goldstone credible? Is Amanpour credible?
War crimes, possible crimes against humanity, and disproportionate force. Those are just some of the charges in a report on the Gaza war, now formally presented to the UN Human Rights Council. Israel gets most of the blame, but Palestinians, Hamas, are faulted as well. Both are accused of failing to distinguish between military and civilian targets.
Hamas can't be accused of failing to distinguish. They deliberately target civilians. Even Goldstone admits this.
Tell us a little bit about Palestinian rocket fire.
They were fired deliberately at civilian areas, at civilian cities and towns in southern Israel, including Sderot and Ashkelon and others.
Israel refused to cooperate with the inquiry, calling it one-sided and shameful.
Amanpour should have pointed out that all 4 members of the fact-finding mission had already expressed their opinion publicly against Israel, especially Christine Chinkin, who signed a letter during the conflict accusing Israel of war crimes. Despite this clear evidence of her bias, Goldstone still thought she'd make a credible member of his mission and refused to exclude her.
Hamas called the report unreasonable. Each side said that it was engaged in self-defense. So will anyone face trial? And what is the role of international law in armed conflict?
Again, false even-handedness. Israel follows the same legal guidelines that the U.S. and allied forces use in Afghanistan and Iraq. Hamas flaunts all these laws of war.
Joining me now here in the studio, Judge Richard Goldstone, lead author of the UN report. Judge Goldstone, thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure, thank you.
I want to start by asking your reaction to the following. There are reports in the Israeli media, and we've asked the Prime Minister's office, about a possible plan this week to present to their cabinet, to his own cabinet, the establishment of a committee, an investigative committee, to probe the findings of your report. What is your reaction to that?
I would be absolutely delighted. That's really what we've asked for in our first recommendation. Is a transparent, open investigation in Israel and in Gaza into the allegations we make in our report.
Do you expect to get one in Gaza?
Well, I certainly hope so, and I think if Israel goes that way, it will put a huge amount of pressure on Hamas.
Did he really say that? Does he believe what he's saying? Hamas, of course, is renowned the world over for its judicial system. Here's Hamas investigating Fatah opponents and getting to the bottom of the matter. And here's the verdict. And this man thinks that Israeli public self-criticism will lead Hamas to follow suit? Surely Amanpour will at least express astonishment at such naivete.
A huge amount of controversy about the report and about your findings.
I guess not.
Do you believe that Israel deliberately, intentionally went out to target civilians?
Well, not as policy, and this is something we haven't looked into, and that is individual liability, criminal liability. That needs a fully fledged formal investigation by investigators, if necessary, prosecution. This wasn't the purpose of our fact-finding mission. We weren't even quasi-judicial, and we certainly didn't get near being judicial.
Did he really say that? This is a bombshell. First off, he's accused Israel of deliberately as policy targeting civilians and civilian infrastructures, and he'll do it again later in the interview. But the real bombshell is the admission that this was a fact-finding, not even quasi-judicial investigation. Amanpour herself tells us the report makes accusations of war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. Surely she'll express surprise at this.
The Israelis say that given the density of the population in Gaza, given the difficulty of distinguishing between military targets and those which are embedded, they say, inside the civilian population. They did the best they could to avoid civilians. This is what Prime Minister Netanyahu last week told CNN's Wolf Blitzer.
Well, certainly.
Let's just listen.
It's absurd. Israel was rocketed, pummeled for 8 years by thousands of rockets that came from Gaza. We tried to get at the rocketeers, those terrorists firing those missiles and rockets, who placed themselves, embedded themselves in homes and schools, in mosques, you name it. And we tried to target these people. We even sent them SMS text messages telling the Palestinian civilians, please get out of harm's way, cellular phones, you name it. So we did everything possible to minimize the loss of innocent civilian lives.
So one of the criticisms of the report is that it didn't do enough to highlight this fact of embedding military targets, military people in civilian areas, whether they be schools, homes, etc.
Well, it's certainly something we looked into.
At this point, I really have to wonder what's going on in Goldstone's head. Here's Colonel Richard Kemp addressing this specific issue.
Mr. President, based on my knowledge and experience, I can say this. During Operation Cast Lead, the Israeli Defense Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare. Israel did so while facing an enemy that deliberately positioned its military capability behind the human shield of the civilian population. The truth is that the IDF took extraordinary measures to give Gaza civilians notice of targeted areas, dropping over 2 million leaflets and making over 100,000 phone calls. Many missions that could have taken out Hamas military capability were aborted to prevent civilian casualties. During the conflict, the IDF allowed huge amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza. To deliver aid virtually into your enemy's hands is, to the military tactician, normally quite unthinkable. But the IDF took on those risks.
And he should know what he's talking about, given his contemporary experience with the Allies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Surely Goldstone's mission heard testimony from Colonel Kemp. But no. Here's Goldstone's letter to Maurice Ostroff on why he didn't interview Kemp. There was no reliance on Colonel Kemp, mainly because in our report we did not deal with the issues he raised regarding the problems of conducting military operations in civilian areas and second-guessing decisions made by soldiers and their commanding officers in the fog of war. We avoided having to do so in the incidents we decided to investigate. Does this sound like the same man Amanpour's interviewing? Does she even know enough to challenge him? Let's listen to his entire answer and see if he's more honest.
And the report didn't question the right of Israel to take action to stop the firing of rockets and mortars, clearly, as we held, serious war crimes. But what Prime Minister Netanyahu ignores completely, and what Israel has ignored, are our criticisms of the way they fought the war. We didn't second-guess generals. We didn't question the difficulty of fighting a war in a heavily built-up civilian area. What we did was question the degree to which innocent civilians were targeted.
Didn't second-guess? From the report, the mission finds it difficult to believe that mortars were the most accurate weapons available at the time. Or, the mission does not consider that the choice of deploying mortar weapons can be justified. The mission does not consider that in these circumstances it was a choice that any reasonable commander would have made. This is doublespeak. If you refuse to investigate the difficulties of conducting war in an urban area, how can you even begin to make observations, much less pass judgments, on whether injured civilians were targeted?
And also, I would add, the huge damage done to the infrastructure of Gaza, factories, bulldozing agricultural fields, bombing the only flour factory and so on. Those are the sorts of aspects that I would certainly suggest are really calling out for investigation.
Hamas boasted that it had prepared surprises for Israeli forces, bunkers under civilian buildings, endless tunnels, mines, and remotely operated roadside bombs in both open fields and even places like the Children's Zoo.
מערכת הפעלה שנמצאת בתוך הגן חיות, ניתן לראות אותה בצורה ברורה כאן למטה. והנה נחשף לנו הבית ספר. תראה לי בבקשה את בית הספר. הנה כל בניין בית הספר. הנה בניין בית הספר. אפשר לראות פה חיות מכל הסוגים, אריות, בנות יענה, עופות. הכל ממולכד.
Hamas turned those places into military targets, and his honor apparently knows nothing of this. But that doesn't stop him from making judgments he himself claimed he wasn't supposed to make. At this point, his honor has to make up his mind. Was this really a fact-finding mission or a judicial inquiry? Is Amanpour aware of the wool he's pulling over her and her viewers' eyes? Is he aware?
We're just going to now put up a graphic which shows the response by Hamas, because we do want to get at the what next aspect of your report. So the Hamas deputy prime minister there, Ahmed Youssef, says that it is a serious report. We'll look into some of the recommendations in the report about crimes committed by Hamas. Now, your report did criticize Hamas for the indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel and targeting Israeli civilians. Again, do you believe that you went enough after the notion of putting their weapon systems or their personnel anywhere near civilian targets?
Absolutely. We certainly looked into that. But in some cases, we assumed that they may well have done that. We didn't find proof, any precise proof of that, but we assumed it might have happened.
Here's an example of the report's treatment of this subject. Let's begin with a speech from a Hamas official that the Goldstone report actually cited.
لذلك شكلوا دروعا بشرية من النساء والأطفال والشيوخ والمجاهدين ليتحدوا بذلك آلة القصف الصهيونية وكأنهم يقولون للعدو الصهيوني إننا نحرص على الموت كما تحرصون على الحياة.
How did they deal with the evidence? They pointed out that the speech was from before Operation Cast Lead, and so not proof of what happened in Cast Lead. Did the good judges then investigate possible examples during Operation Cast Lead, like the many reports that Hamas had set up headquarters under Shifa Hospital? Or does His Honor only consider civilians as human shields if they're healthy?
But even then, that didn't justify the sort of civilian casualties that ensued as a result of Operation Cast Lead.
In other words, he invokes figures that close research, already done for him, dramatically contradicts. He swallowed the faulty numbers hook, line, and sinker, and then goes on to judge Israel harshly. Does Amanpour know anything about this? Or is she, like so many in the media, prisoner of the beliefs and expectations they already formed during the fighting?
Were you surprised by the reaction to your report?
Well, I was surprised at the tremendous criticism, and I think unfair criticism, that came out of some quarters in Israel, and also there were some Hamas spokespersons who criticized the report. You know, I wasn't surprised, but I must say the depth and venom of the opposition has been surprising.
The reason I ask you is because even some Israelis who feel that unless they investigate, they're going to get an international investigation. In the Jerusalem Post, shortly after the report was made public, one writer wrote that the kind of report that came out closed down what could be or should be a vital debate even before it got started because of the heightened nature of this precise report. He said, for instance, a debate about when does negligence become recklessness? When does recklessness slip into wanton callousness and then into deliberate disregard for innocent human life? This Israeli writer basically said that this is an area of legitimate debate, but because of the heightened feelings, it's probably not going to happen.
Aside from this being a stumbling, repetitive question, she's missed the main point. The author here was David Landau, former editor of Haaretz, who scandalized Israel by telling Condoleezza Rice that the United States should rape Israel into making the necessary concessions for peace. So hardly someone who defends Israel right or wrong. And his objection was that Goldstone accused Israel of deliberately targeting civilians, which even hypercritics in Israel know is not true.
Well, you know, it seems now that there's at least a prospect of it happening, and certainly there has been an active debate. If one reads, and I have been trying to keep up to the best of my ability with the Israeli media, the report has opened a huge debate within Israel, and that's a very good thing. And I think it's opened a debate internationally, and it's certainly my hope that the effect of the report will have consequences in the future for the protection of innocent civilians in many places of the world.
Actually, the vast spectrum of Israeli opinion, right, left, and center, thinks that Goldstone's report is a recipe for victimizing civilians around the world because it benefits terrorists who put their own civilians systematically at risk by attacking from their midst, and comes down heavily on those who respond to these attacks.
Do you think it has an effect in terms of other prosecutions? For instance, there are people who say, including potentially members of the ICC, that some of what NATO or the US is doing, let's say in Afghanistan or in Iraq, the whole issue of civilian casualties has become huge in Afghanistan.
Well, that's correct, but the United States, I think, to its credit, has always taken care to protect innocent civilians. When innocent civilians have been killed and injured, it hasn't been because it was intentional. It may have been negligent. It may even have been, I don't know, I haven't looked into it. It may have been more than negligent, but I have no doubt it wasn't deliberate.
I have no doubt it wasn't deliberate? This is amazing. He shows that he's working from negative prejudice when judging Israel and positive prejudice when judging the United States. Amanpour knows about the latest targeted strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where U.S. military killed 700 civilians to get 14 targets, almost a 50-to-1 ratio. Israel's targeted killing ratios are closer to 2 targets for 1 civilian killed. Even if Amanpour doesn't know these details, surely she can question his whitewash of the U.S. and indictment of the Israelis.
So, again, are you saying that it was intentional in Israel?
Reasonably good follow-up.
Certainly, some of it was intentional. There was no mistake about the bombing of civilian buildings, the Legislative Council, the sorts of factories, food factories, which are civilian, that I was talking about. That wasn't an error. The Israeli army have very precise munitions.
Did he really say that?
Do you believe that Israel deliberately, intentionally went out to target civilians?
Well, not as policy.
To follow up there are some 100 investigations, according to the Israelis, that are going on, and some 23 or so that are possibly being brought to criminal trial. Does that go to what you're asking for, because you talked about individual responsibility?
No, not at all. These are secret military inquiries. In very few cases have the victims been spoken to. My understanding is that the Israeli military are relying almost entirely on what they get from their own forces. That's hardly the sort of inquiry that's going to satisfy victims.
And what if, as in the case of Abed Rabo, where IDF soldiers were accused of shooting in cold blood children whom the Palestinian media had already recorded as dead from an airstrike, the victims are the Israeli soldiers unjustly accused?
I want to play also what Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State here in the United States, has had to say about the report.
We believe that the mandate for the Goldstone report was one-sided, and that many of the recommendations are appropriately dealt with by the institutions within Israel. Therefore, we believe that the appropriate venue within the international system is the Human Rights Council. We and other nations will be engaged about that, but we have grave concerns about the recommendations.
So, first of all, grave concerns about the recommendations. What precisely do you think she means by that?
Well, she may mean having reference to the Security Council. It's difficult to deal with Secretary Clinton's criticisms without knowing what they are. I mean, she wasn't specific. No.
I think she said to keep it within the Human Rights Council and not to put it to the Security Council.
But the problem is the Human Rights Council has got no enforcement powers at all.
Note, Goldstone here regrets that the Human Rights Council has no enforcement powers. Now, those who are informed about what a joke the Human Rights Council is, run by countries who on principle violate their own citizens' human rights, and which has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than all other nations combined, the idea that the Human Rights Council should have enforcement powers is absurd, and its implementation would be disastrous. To her credit, Amanpour goes straight to this issue.
Does it bother you, the reputation that the Human Rights Council has, which is as an basically anti-Israeli?
Absolutely, and this is the reason I initially refused to get involved on what I consider to be a very lopsided, unfair resolution. It was only when the mandate was broadened that I was prepared to get involved, and certainly I've on many occasions spoken about what I consider to be the unfortunate over-concentration by the Human Rights Council on Israel.
Now, we talked about each side conducting their own investigations. Israel has its justice, the wheels of justice that turn. What do you expect, really, you can get out of Hamas in Gaza?
Well, Hamas have courts open. There are courts in Gaza. People are convicted. Some people, regrettably in my view, are sentenced to be executed. But if Hamas hasn't got the sufficient resources, hasn't got sufficient lawyers and judges, which I doubt, I've no doubt that the international community will fill any gap that there may be in such an absence of resources.
This is absolutely amazing and tells us eloquently what kind of bizarre universe Goldstone lives in. The New York Times ran a long article about Hamas's vigilante justice, shooting suspected collaborators as they lay on stretchers in Shifa Hospital. Goldstone doesn't seem to get it. Hamas is proud of their justice and of their use of civilian shields. For them, these aren't war crimes.
وإذا به يسأل أذكى أبو بلال الشعبي قلت نعم فقال أنا الأمن الإسرائيلي معك 5 دقائق دخلي التولادة فقفلت الجوال على الفور وإذا واتصلت ببعض الأصدقاء فهرع الأهالي عبر مكبرات الصوت وبلأوا سطح المنزل وظلوا حتى الآن يعني مرابطون على سطح المنزل إلى أن يشاء الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Will Amanpour finally express even mild incredulity at this naivete?
And just final question.
Apparently not.
Where does one go from here in terms of international justice, given the controversy over this report?
Well, I think what's very important is that double standards need to stop. It's really unfair that international criminal justice only involves smaller, weaker powers.
I'm speechless. Well, almost. He thinks it's double standards to prosecute genocidal maniacs like the Hutus in Rwanda and mass rapists like the Serbs in Bosnia, but somehow unfair not to also go after armies that try and abide by legal regulations? The UN, the organization he's working for, had 8 years to protest hundreds of Hamas suicide bombers and thousands of Qassams targeting Israeli civilians. They responded by condemning Israel dozens of times, and Hamas never. This is an inverted double standard. Now consider his response to Fareed Zakaria, who asks him to compare what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda with what happened in Gaza.
One doesn't here, in respect of Gaza, get anywhere, in my view, anywhere near that sort of situation. It's very different.
So, if he knows the two cases can't be compared, what double standard is he complaining about?
I think it's very important for that reason that the United States should become much more active and much more involved in the International Criminal Court. I think it's moving in that direction, but I'd love to see it move a lot quicker.
Now here's a twist. Don't go after the weaker powers, but go get the superpowers to go after Israel. Is he trying to flatter the U.S. into suicide? By the Goldstone standard, they're major war criminals in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan.
On that note, Judge Goldstone, thank you for joining us, and we'll obviously be following the developments in this.
Okay, we've seen the interviewer question and Goldstone respond. Goldstone contradicts himself repeatedly. His contradictions and evasions may, in fact, help explain why his report is so flawed. And you, Christian, did about 1/4 of your homework, and as a result, let him off the hook repeatedly. Amanpour, C+. Goldstone, F. This is Richard Landis from the Second Draft.